Today we are going to do the second part of our two-part series lecture on migration and development. So, in the first part, in the previous class, we looked at what the conventional mainstream migration and development discourse entails, and then we looked at Hein de Haas's paper on the paradoxes of migration and development. Now, today, like I said, in the second part of this lecture, we are going to do three things. So, first we will critically look at the migration and development discourse, also the migration and development nexus as detailed in a paper by Martin Giger and Anton Picot. Now, so I will take you through the paper. This paper is actually the introduction to a special issue in the journal Population, Space and Place, which has a collection of papers which critically looks at the migration and development discourse, also known as the migration and development nexus. The second thing that we will do in today's lecture is that we will look at more structuralist perspectives. So, we will look at Latin American scholars Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues' work on a more structuralist perspective, a counter-hegemonic perspective on the migration and development discourse. And then we'll end with a bit of a summarize the opposing views of migration and development based on Hein de Haas's work. So, coming to the first part, to Giger and Picot's work on the migration and development nexus. So, what Giger and Picot are really arguing is that, the mainstream migration and development nexus, whether it's the academic or the policy discussion, it remains very, very superficial. And why is it superficial? Because it's a non-critical paradigm and it sees the relationship between migration and development as natural, as something that can be achieved through direct or indirect policy initiatives, right. So, like I mentioned, their papers in introduction in the special issue in Population, Space and Place in 2013, and then this issue collectively challenges the mainstream perspective by showing that the connection between migration and development, it's actually not so natural, it's not naturally positive, it's actually a product of a political construction, it's a product of a scientific construction, and that's what they argue. So, what they do is that they demonstrate that both migration and development policies are embedded in power relations which are asymmetrical, power relations which are imbalanced between the north and south. So, they say that really calls for building upon the findings of critical development studies to rethink the migration and development nexus. So, let us do a quick recap of the mainstream migration discourse. So, what they are arguing is in the mainstream migration and development discourse, the central role played by migrants and diasporas in the development of their countries of origin, whether it's through remittances, whether it's through return migration, is central, and but it's also long unrecognized. So, the second thing that we know of the mainstream migration and development discourse is that the context is that mobility is very limited, international mobility is very limited. So, therefore, the potential impact on world development of even a small liberalization of labor mobility would be quite something, right. And coming to the third point, so what they are arguing is that you need to have both sending and receiving countries, right. Immigration cannot happen without emigration. So, there is a complementarity in sending and receiving countries to ensure that growth occurs, right. The fourth thing that they emphasize is the fact that there is, in the mainstream discourse, there is this attractiveness in the discourse of temporary migration, of circulatory labor migration, and the schemes that various developed countries have, they are largely seen as an ideal compromise, more generally seen as an example of sound, balanced, well-managed immigration policies. So this course is largely coming from the north, right? And so we need to be aware of that. And so therefore, this overall spirit of optimism that we see in this new migration and development discourse, there is a general migration and development optimism that is there in a lot of policy organizations. This is somewhat surprising. Giger and Pico argue, and they say that this actually contrasts with many states' difficulties or even failures in fostering development, in regulating migration, and so on. So they are asking us to be a little critical of this mainstream discourse, which they say is not empirically as positive as it seems in certain policy spaces. Now, what are Giger and Pico arguing? So first they are saying that there is a need to step back and interrogate some of the implicit assumptions and hidden shortcomings of the migration and development discourse. And they give us an example of academic research, they give us an example of political discussions that largely ignore history. And so they are saying that, and others have also said this, Castles, De Haas, they've reminded us that the relationship between migration and development is nothing new. It's been the object of policy intervention since the 1950s, largely in the context of internal migration, where many of the earlier theoretical developments took place, as we saw in the course, whether it's Ravenstein, whether it's Lee. And so what they're saying is that, hey, these ideas are pretty old, they're several decades old. So the migration and development is nothing new in that sense. They also tell us that the discourse of migration and development tends to ignore findings of most empirical studies, right? Though it calls for evidence-based policy making, and especially amongst international organizations, evidence-based policy making is seen as very important, but you will see that the existing evidence, right, the existing evidence, and I will take you through one of the examples towards the end of this lecture, is simply not something that justifies the enthusiasm surrounding migration and development. In other words, they're saying that the international migration managers actually have a very different perspective of international migration compared to migrants themselves and so on. They then go on to argue that migration alone hardly removes structural development constraints. And even though migration benefits individuals, migration can benefit some communities, it cannot be blamed for underdevelopment, and neither can you substantially expect migration to foster development, right, in otherwise unattractive environments. So in other words, you see, this is again something that Castle said in a different way. So migration is a part of broader social processes. So you cannot expect migration alone to address structural issues, right? And then they highlight the biases, the omissions that characterize mainstream discussion. And one fundamental omission is that of internal migration. So you see, much of our discussion on migration and development is linked with international migration. Internal migration is just simply bypassed in a majority of migration and development literature. Now, in a very different vein, Giger and Pico also highlight that the political constraints that underlie the connection between migration and development are quite strong, and especially at the international level. So, migration is actually too sensitive an issue to be discussed in a multilateral fashion, and then tying it to, topics, tying it to consensual topics such as development, and to sort of, look at it in terms of a strategy to export this in international policy arena is something that can, that is just very, it can be far-fetched, and we are seeing this now, We are seeing now in the context of the US how it can backfire, and whether it's in the context of migration policies under the Trump administration, or even in many European countries in recent years with the growth of a far right movement. You see how migration policies are shifting and changing and so on. So therefore, political constraints are real, and we must not forget that, especially in the international policy arena. I now come to Raul Delgado Wise's work with his colleagues, and so this is largely, they are also critiquing the migration and development discourse, the mainstream discourse, and what Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues are doing is they're furthering the arguments made by Giger and Pico that we saw in the previous slide, and their work is in today's class. So Raul Delgado Wise is a Latin American scholar who's been working for several decades on migration and development, and some of his work is really seminal in this field. And I'm most recently with his colleagues, he's published a book, an edited volume called The Handbook of Migration and Development, a Counter-Hegemonic Perspective. So what they're saying is, what Delgado Wise and his colleagues are saying is that as far as the migration and development nexus is concerned, there's a need for critical exploration of strengths and weaknesses of existing strategies, existing practices, which are connected with the migration and development nexus. And then we need to look at it in terms of alternative development models. So we need to question some of the issues which are emerging from the empirics of migration and development, which are actually in tension with the mainstream discourses of migration and development. And what are these issues, right? So we need to question accumulation by dispossession, forced migration, necropolitical securitization, hyper-exploitation, and asymmetrical power relations undergirding a structurally conditioned extractivism. And also, in very many destination contexts, you have the brutal politics of expulsion, and some of these empirics, again, we are seeing in many contemporary migration streams of international migration, even of internal migration, as you will see in the course of this course. Now, what Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues are arguing is that this issue needs to be pursued in terms of two major critical perspectives. What are these critical perspectives? So the first one pertains to a scrutiny of the framework of action, right? The framework of action in relation to different economic, social, political and cultural conditions and discourses on the ground with respect to particular voices, such as voices of national governments, local struggles, movements of civil society. So the first is that there are all of these actors, and we need to scrutinize, we need to examine the perspectives of each one of these actors that are involved. The second thing that they say is that the second perspective pertains to the accountability of emerging governance regimes, right? So you have a lot of international migration governance regimes, right, that kind of support the migration and development discourse. But so we need these regimes to be accountable, right? And we need accountability in terms of what is the coherence of their normative discourse, their codification, their institutionalization, their modes of implementation, and the sanctions that they implement. So some of the ways in which we can address this or ask is related to what is the role of civil society movements in migration governance? Are they also embedded in asymmetric power relations? And compared to transnational corporations, financial capital, what is their standing? Similarly, what about discourses of social justice Is economic growth given so much importance that social justice takes a back seat? So therefore, in the context of sanctions, for example, do they have genuine policies and practices, or it's just hogwash? Similarly, they ask if we can discern a more complex picture where struggles and politics of external actors are concerned. For instance, trade unions, civil society movements, what is their role in dominant frameworks of governance? Again, they ask if we can discern policies such as social policies, labor standards, autonomous policies from below, all of these vis-a-vis migrants and migration regimes and so on, right? So these are again very fundamental questions that they are asking. And we know, I think by now you also have some sense of the migration and development discourse and how the mainstream development discourse does not accommodate a lot of these concerns. So when we look at it from the lens of critical development studies, when we revisit the migration and development nexus from critical development studies, we find it to be in tension with the mainstream migration and development discourse, right? So as you know, the mainstream discourse is reified by a large body of empirical and policy literature that celebrates and valorizes remittances, viewing remittances as a panacea for migration and development. Now, in contrast to this dominant discourse on migration, there is an alternative view. There has emerged a counter-hegemonic perspective, and this is developed by Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues, and which views migration development nexus as, and I quote, a dialectical rather than a unidirectional relationship and approach, utilizing a multidimensional perspective that encompasses economic, political, social, environmental, cultural, racial, ethnic, gender, geographical and demographic factors. Unlike the mainstream perspective, this approach encompasses A. an examination of the multiple violations of human and labor rights suffered by the migrants themselves and their families in origin, transit and destination countries, and B. an in-depth analysis of the root causes underlying the complex relationship between migration and development under neoliberal globalization, unquote. So what Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues are arguing is that in the context of the Global South, neoliberal economic development has been characterized by economic restructuring and reforms that have led to precarity. It's led to the precarization of formal employment, increased unemployment and growing labor informality. Now, within these contemporary dynamics of uneven development, new types of migration, including migration on account of dispossession, migration on account of unemployment, exclusion, they have become prominent. So here, in our context, in many empirical streams, it's critical to foreground accumulation by dispossession, right? And in a multi-scalar lens, where migration is seen not as a cause or as a consequence, but a central part of social change. So you see how they're drawing also on Stephen Castle's work that we discussed earlier. And so as we saw being argued by Castle in our previous lecture, as well as Hein de Haas in his thesis on the paradoxes of migration. And in India too, as we'll see in the later lectures on circular migration, our growth process, our process of economic growth and development has been such that it's been characterized by increasing inequalities, and these in turn have played a role in explaining contemporary migration patterns, which are largely, if you look at India, much of the Indian migration, internal migration, is from the poor to prosperous regions, from backward to advanced states, and from rural to urban areas. And in particular, in the context of Delgado Wise and his colleagues' work, we find in India that several disaggregated context-specific migration streams point towards adverse incorporation of migrants in development. So, a lot of these migration streams are distress oriented. They are coming from spaces of structural constraint, geographies of structural constraint. So, this framework, this counter-hegemonic framework of migration and development developed by Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues is very relevant for specific migration streams in the Indian context and of course in the global south. So, the other part is therefore we need to then also look at disaggregated streams. It's very important that we look at disaggregated streams of migration, because from the same region as a source region, you'll have multiple migration streams, perhaps even at the same destination. But which stream is adversely incorporated, which stream is positively incorporated, that is something that depends on context, it's a function of caste, class, all kinds of things. So, therefore, it's very important that we look at disaggregated migration streams to understand the relationship between migration and development. So, then, coming back to the second point about migration management and how we need to critically look at that ecosystem, Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues asked very specific questions, and these questions really then address several issues, several fundamental issues in the contemporary management infrastructure, the ecosystem of international migration. So, what they ask is who governs? Who is governing the contemporary migration system of international migration? Who sets the agenda? Who are the decision makers? Who acts? Whose actions play a role? Who is responsible for what and from whom? When you look at these questions, right, these questions concern both source and destination countries. And when you look at these questions and you ask who is doing it, right, the answer would be that it's largely the destination country. These questions also show us the asymmetry between the north and the south in migration management system, and this is so relevant, empirically so relevant, given the huge upheaval of migration and migration policies going on right now in much of the global north, right. So, therefore, in answering these questions, Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues challenged the mainstream discourse to contribute towards the building of a counter-hegemonic perspective, as they argue in their book. Now, the last thing that we do in this lecture is that we end with Hein de Haas's take on this. And so, what de Haas does is he gives us in his paper the opposing views of migration and development, what he classifies as the migration optimists and the migration pessimists. So, let us take a step back and ask a more fundamental question about the impacts of migration. Now, in destination countries, migration tends to stimulate overall growth and innovation, and there's a lot of evidence for that, and there's very clear evidence for that. However, much contested question is whether migration encourages development of the countries of origin, or does it actually hinder the development of the countries of origin. Now, over the past few decades, this issue has sparked heated debate in policy and research circles, as Hein de Haas tells us. On the one hand, you have migration optimists who argue that migration brings growth, it brings prosperity to origin countries. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have migration pessimists who argue that migration undermines development through draining origin countries of their scarce human and financial resources. So, while the pessimists predict a brain drain, the optimists predict a brain gain. And this division that we see in the between optimists and pessimists, Hein de Haas argues it reflects the more general division between historical structuralists also known as neo-Marxists, and functionalists or neoclassical theories that view migration on the one hand as exploitation and on the other hand as an optimization mechanism respectively. So, we just discussed the structural view of migration, largely focusing on Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues, and the neoclassical view, the functional view, is something we have studied in an earlier lecture, right? So, you are also getting a sense of this. And so, therefore, the debate about migration and development has swung back and forth from optimism in the post-1945 and the post-World War II period to pessimism since the 1970s to more renewed optimism since the 2000s and more recently again pessimism, right? And what De Haas is arguing is that this debate reflects a broader opposition not only between development paradigms but also economic philosophies and economic ideologies. So, with that we come to the end of this lecture. This was a two-part series on migration and development, and there are three main readings. The first is a working paper by Hein De Haas titled The Paradoxes of Migration and Development. The second is an article by Giger and Picou that was published as an introduction to a special issue in the journal Population, Space and Place. The article is titled Migration Development and the Migration Development Nexus. And the third is a book, you can read the first chapter of the book by Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues. The book is titled Handbook on Migration and Development, a Counter-Hegemonic Perspective. Thank you very much. I hope you found the lecture useful.